Welcome to this video on biological timing responses. There are 4 parts to the video. Number 1 is about biorhythms, our body clock. This is Jane. She has an important routine that she follows every morning, waking up, getting a coffee and going to work. Now, she can keep this routine because she has a great alarm clock and because her friend Paul will wake her up and distract her whenever anything's going wrong. So this is how Jane keeps her timing. However, if you took those things away, Jane actually still has an internal body clock. So she'd still wake up even if there wasn't an alarm clock at some time. And it's this internal clock that is called our biorhythm. And the definition for that is it's a cycle of events that's controlled endogenously or internally. So to delve into a bit more detail about what that actually means, people put human volunteers in this big underground chamber. So there was no change in temperature, no change in humidity, light, sound, or anything. So what they're trying to do is cut these people off from all external cues of daylight, sound, anything. Then they observed, what's the time frame of our wake-sleep cycle? And they found that it was actually close to 24 hours. So even despite the fact that we often get woken up because the sun rises or the birds start singing, we still would wake up even without these factors due to our internal body clock. And this is called a circadian rhythm. It's another term you'll need to remember. It's our internal body clock that's approximately daily. This cycle of events comes in 3 different forms. We just touched on one, which is the roughly daily cycle called circadian rhythm, and we'll come back to that. But starting with the bigger scale is called circa-annual, which is roughly a year cycle. So when we look at external cues, which is the Earth orbiting all the way around the Sun, and it takes 365 days, that's an external cue. That happens outside of our bodies. And we call this 1 year. That's a natural cycle. The next thing is we have a biorhythm. So we have an internal body clock which roughly predicts the season. Despite the fact that birds and other animals don't have calendars, they still know when winter and summer and spring is. This biorhythm, this internal body clock, is called circa-annual. And you'll see all of our internal ones start with the word circa, annual being year. One of the best ways to judge this is the changing of the seasons, because we have 4 seasons in a year for the most part. And the most accurate way for an animal to tell when a year changes is the seasons, and more specifically, when the photoperiod, which is the day length, changes, so it gets shorter, they know it must be getting into autumn or winter, and when it starts getting longer, they know it's getting into spring and summer. So that photoperiod, or the day length, is the most important way that animals and plants tell about a natural annual cycle. So that's the first type of biorhythm, which is circa-annual, and its external period, 1 year or 365 days. We also have a daily cycle, which we touched on before. So that's 24 hours, and that's one rotation of the Earth around its own axis. So we can see there's days and then there's nights, and that's the easiest way to tell these things. And we call that, our internal clock, our circadian rhythm. And the easiest way to tell that is the change in light from the sun, for example, from sound as different things start to happen, from temperature as we warm up, and from the humidity in the air actually as well. And the final thing is tidal rhythms. So tides happen just over every 12 hours, and we call this circa-tidal. It's our internal biorhythm. Now for people it's not so relevant, but for things like crabs and crustaceans, tides matter a lot, and so they have an internal body clock predicting when the tides will take place. Now the easiest way for an animal to know whether that's happening is they can actually feel the water rushing in and out depending on when the tide is actually moving. So your take-home message from this part is that there is an external period which goes on of maybe a year, a day, or a tide, but we also have an internal body clock, a circa-annual body clock, which is our annual body clock, our 1 year body clock, our circadian body clock, and our circa-tidal body clock. And even when we don't have these external cues, we still have our internal body clock telling us what's going on. And we covered the 3 different ways that animals can roughly tell when a year, a day, and a tide has passed. The second part we're going to talk about is entrainment. This is training ourselves to line our internal body clocks up with our external cues. Let's cover this in more detail and explain what it actually means. So sometimes you get your internal body clock, your endogenous rhythm, it doesn't match up with what's happening out there. You want to sleep in and you don't want to wake up when the sun gets up. It's not always perfectly synced up. So you might be sleeping, the sun might rise, it's an external cue, and that prompts you to wake up, because the light's shining in your eyes. So this environmental or external cue that prompts us is called a Zeitgeber. So you're going to need to memorize this word Zeitgeber because it means any cue that helps to train our internal body clocks. And this doesn't just apply to people, more commonly it applies to animals as well. Now, the process of a Zeitgeber, an external cue helping to train our body clocks, is called entrainment. So entrainment is like training ourselves to fit with our external body clock of a day, a year, a tide, whatever it happens to be. And the individual factors which help us, the water rushing in and out for tides, the length of day for annual stuff, and the day-night cycle for individual days. These are all different examples of Zeitgebers. So to bring together what we've learned so far, we had Jane. She had her internal biorhythm of a circannual, which is around a year, circadian, which is around a day, and circatidal, which is around a half day-ish, so about a tide, 12 and a bit hours. Then we also had the environmental cues. We had exactly a year, which is one orbit of the Earth around the Sun, exactly a day, which is 24 hours, or the Earth rotating around its axis, and a tide going in and out, which is exactly 12.4 hours. Now, within those, we had certain cues, which we learnt were called Zeitgebers. Now, these cues help us align our internal annual clock with a year. And for example, these were most importantly the seasons and the day length, which indicated the seasons, otherwise called the photoperiod. We also learnt for days that you got temperature, humidity, light or sound, all helped us to line our internal body clock up with the external time frame of a day. And we had circatidal, which is ocean movements, is what told us that tides were going in and out, in and out. And that's what helps certain animals get their internal tide clock going, called circatidal rhythms. And the process of matching up our internal body clock up with external cues is called entrainment. One final note is that your internal biorhythm might not always match this. It varies from person to person. These are genetically inherited from your parents. And that's why every person is a little bit different. However, the environment or the external cues are the same for everybody, so everybody can get entrained together to turn up to school at the same time. We're up to 3 out of 4 parts now, and this part is on the benefits of these biological rhythms. So there are 4 benefits we're going to cover one by one. The first of which is it allows us to predict different events that need to build up food supplies or reserves. For example, a bear needs to know that the winter's coming so they can get really fat, hibernate right throughout the winter where they don't eat anything, and then they'll still have enough energy left to survive. Or another example is migration. If you're about to do a huge journey and you're going to fly and use all your energy, you need to build up your food or reserves so that you can actually get through that time period of high energy flying. The second thing is you want to synchronize your processes with what's going on around you so that you're not out of sync with everybody else. So for example, when elephants want to reproduce, they need the best time of year to enhance survival. So for animals, there's 3 different factors. One is they want to coordinate the production of gametes. So for example, when the female is fertile and the male is ready to mate with them, gives the highest chance of fertilization and therefore the highest chance of reproduction and survival of the species. The second is that the feeding of the young, we want that to coincide with a seasonal peak in food availability. If you have a baby and all the food dries up, it's not very good for raising your kid. So therefore, you want to have your baby right around springtime when lots of food is becoming available so that they can grow big and strong before the next winter. The third factor is you want to allow for growth and development before the cold, harsh temperature of the winter comes in. It's not just about food. So you want to give them the nice summertime to go big, strong, think life is cheery and wonderful before the winter sets in. So these are the benefits of biological clocks within animals, but the same thing applies for plants as well. So you'll notice that a lot of flowers will flower together all in the spring. And there are benefits to this factor. The first one of which is that pollinators, so this is how all the flowers get fertilized with each other and how they reproduce themselves, might all be flying or buzzing around in the springtime. So the flowers want to come out at the same time so they get the benefit of those pollinators being around so that they can get pollinated and reproduce themselves. Other trees, for example, might flower to have fruit growth which aligns with other animals that could eat the fruit and disperse the seeds elsewhere, or high winds which could blow the seeds around. And the last point, which we kind of touched on, it's not just when pollinators are around that these plants want to flower, it's also because of that cross-pollination. So you can actually mix up the gene pool a lot, which makes your plant offspring much more likely to survive. So these are the benefits for plants for actually synchronizing when you flower or lining up your biological clocks. The third benefit of biological clocks are synchronizing social activities, not just internal processes. So you might want to actually socialize together, go to school together, have weekends together, that kind of thing. But also, it allows animals to congregate for mass migration so that they can all come together at the same time. It also allows animals to come together in non-breeding seasons as well as breeding seasons for different activities. And it has a safety in numbers, so that's why animals want to socialize together. The fourth thing is it allows animals to navigate. They can use the sun and the star positions to adjust their compasses. Remember, we learned that sun and star positions change throughout the day, And so knowing the time of year means that animals can actually alter their compasses to know that the sun is much lower in the sky in wintertime than it is in summertime, for example. So these are all of the benefits that you need to remember. Now the fourth part we want to go on to is photoperiodism. Now that's day length in flowering plants. This is a specific example which seems to come up often. So we're going to cover that especially. So you'll get a plant, and the plant has to know the day length somehow, but they don't have eyes and ears and smell. They need to use other tools. So inside they have this pigment called phytochrome. Now phytochrome is called PR, but there's another version of phytochrome called PFR. Now when you give a plant some sunlight, it quickly turns all of the PR into its other form, PFR. So while that might not mean anything right now, in the nighttime, this PFR is a little bit unstable. You can't keep it as PFR too long, so it starts to slowly revert back to PR, its original version of cytochrome. So what this actually means is that the plant can say, if I have lots and lots of PR in my system, it means the night is really long. So as soon as a certain amount of PR builds up inside a plant, the plant knows that it's getting into winter, for example, or shorter day lengths. Or all of a sudden, if there's not very much PR, so you hit a certain threshold, then you know that now the days are getting longer or the nights are getting shorter, and therefore it's probably coming into spring. So the plant can actually tell the day length by figuring out how much PFR turns into PR, and that happens slowly over the night. So a long night means a lot of PFR turns back into PR. And then the day length, it all goes back to PFR again and resets itself. So what I've just discussed is how this all works at quite a deep level. Certain hormones turning back and forth into each other, which allows a plant to say how long the night actually is, and therefore what season it probably is. But in your test questions, you're often going to see diagrams that might look a lot like this. So what you'll see is like a bar graph where the grey part is the nighttime and the light part is the daytime. And you'll see that in what's called short day plants, which means plants that flower when the days are short, you can see that when the day is beyond a certain length, it's bigger than that, no flowering will occur. However, when the night is beyond a certain length, or the day is shorter than that length, the short day plants will flower. Now this certain length is called critical day length. If the day is longer than the critical day length, these short day plants won't flower. Or if the day length is shorter than this critical day length, the plants will flower if they're short day plants. But here's an interesting little exception. If you put one single flash of light in the nighttime, it makes it feel to the plant like it's a long day again or a short night. And that's because in the nighttime we had all of this PFR slowly turning back to PR, and we needed to build up a lot of PR to know that it was a long night as a plant. However, as soon as this big flash of light comes in, it suddenly and very quickly changes all the PR back to PFR and resets the whole thing. So it's like the night is just starting again. So that's why a single flash of light in the middle of the night makes a short day feel like a very long day, because it really resets the plant's counter of how long the night is. So the plant doesn't really count how long the day is, it sees how long the night is. So if you break up the plant's nighttime, it resets its counter and thinks it's a short night, therefore it must be a long day, and if you're a short day plant, you're not going to flower. Now there's not just short day plants, there's also long day plants as well. So these are the opposite. It means when the day is long, they're going to flower. And long means longer than the critical day length. But when the day is short, which means shorter than the critical day length, these long day plants will not flower. And the same thing happens again. If you put a break in the middle of the night, it resets its counter for how long the night actually is. It thinks the night is short, therefore the day must be long, so it starts to flower, even though the night is actually pretty long. Now this critical day length varies from plant to plant. It relates to where they live in the earth and to what time of year they actually want to flower. So if you ever needed to know this, they'd tell you the information you needed in the question. But the key things you need to know are the words critical day length, and the fact that a short day is a day that's shorter than that day length, and a long day means the day is longer than that critical day length. And the other key thing is that if you do a break in the night, it's the same as a long day. So while these plants are called short day plants and long day plants, it would probably be more accurate to call them long night plants and short night plants, because that would account for the daybreak. But don't do that in your exams because it's not technically correct for biology. So here's what you need to know. You need to know for our biorhythms that we have an internal body clock called a biorhythm, and that can be an annual clock called circannual. It can be a circadian clock, which is around a day, and it can be circatidal, which is around a half day, around a tide. We also have environmental factors that these align with roughly. We have a year, which is just over 365 days. We have a day, which is 24 hours, and we have a tide, which is just over 12 hours. So this is the timing of the environment. We also have cues that help us align our internal body clock with the environment. These cues are called Zeitgebers. and they're different for the year, for the day, and for the tide. So for a year, we covered seasons and day length. And remember, day length was the most important way that we could tell what season it was and what time of the year it was. We also learned days, so you can see temperature, humidity, light, or sound, which helps you tell when it's a day. And tide. We can actually feel the tides moving in and out if we were living in the ocean, and this actually mattered to us. And the process of these Zeitgebers aligning our internal body clock with our environment is called entrainment. So this is what you need to remember. We then covered the benefits of biorhythms, which was allowing animals or plants to predict events that could come and build up reserves. Plants and animals could synchronize their internal physiological processes. So physiological just means what they're actually doing. For example, when they actually flower or when they become fertile. We also learned that they could synchronize up their social activities, and we could allow the animals that use the sun and the stars to navigate themselves to actually use it as a compass and adjust that compass according to the time of year, because the sun and the stars change depending on the time of the year. And finally, we learned about photoperiodism, which is the length of the day for plants to flower or not. Now, we saw a bar graph. You could also see it as a pie chart, where the light part is the length of day. So here it's long, which means long day plants will flower and short day plants won't. Whereas if it was, say, wintertime and you only had a short day but a long night, then the short day plants would flower, but the long day plants would not. Now remember, if you have a flash of light in the middle of the night, this breaks up the night and resets the counter for how long the night actually is. So it's the same as saying a long day. So let's look at an example question now. So when we look at this, we have both plants and animals need to carefully time their annual activities, just like reproduction. Despite the weather conditions, many species are still going to reproduce at the same time every year. So for example, we have a tui here. They start breeding in late September, and the New Zealand tree fuchsia flowers between August and September. And this is when the young tui is actually seeking their food. So we've got the tui, which reproduces around the same time, and we've got these flowers around the same time as well. So we need to answer these three parts of the questions. So let's go through these points one by one. First of all, looking at the probable environmental cues for reproduction to begin in both the plants and animals. So how do the plants and animals know to reproduce at that time? Remember, the most reliable way for a plant or an animal to tell the time of year is by the day length. This is also called the photoperiod, the period of light. So the most reliable cue we could write is photoperiod. So this is the length of the day, and that relates to a certain time of year. So this is very important because it reflects the seasons. So that's the most likely environmental cue for reproduction in these plants and animals. The second bullet point was the importance of accurate timing for reproduction, and we discussed this in plants and animal benefits of synchronizing together. So we could write here that, say, plants of the same species flower at the same time, and that's because pollinators are available. It occurs when environmental conditions are favorable for fruit growth and seed dispersal. That means it's warming up and lots of places are looking for food. And it coordinates flowering to increase the chance of cross-pollination, so pollinators can do everybody all at once. Whereas when we looked at animals, we learned different benefits. So you could coordinate when you produce your gametes, so what time of the year you both want to mate. And this will coincide ideally with a seasonal peak in food, and also allow the young offspring to grow up in a favorable environment. So a climate like summer, which is much nicer than it would be being born in winter. You're not so likely to die. So if we look at this specific question, we could actually talk about the tui and the flower. We could say that the fuchsia flower plant needs pollinating by the tui, and the tui needs food for itself and its young. So these two species have actually evolved together, and they have this positive reciprocal effect with each other. It's co-evolution. The plant wins and the bird wins, so this is a win-win situation. And the final point were the mechanisms that keep time in plants and animals. So we went into a lot of depth with plants about how they tell the day length, about their mechanisms for timekeeping. And we can talk about that hormone called phytochrome. That two forms, the fact that PR is converted to PFR during the daytime when there's light, and this happens very quickly. And then PFR is unstable, so it very slowly over the night reverts back to PR, its original form. So the length of darkness is measured by how much PR builds up. If it all starts as PFR at the start of the night and slowly goes back to PR, if it's a long night, there's going to be lots of PR left over. So we can say, thus, this determines the night length, which is actually much more important than the day length. So once the PR hits a certain level, that's your critical day length. Either it'll start flowering or stop flowering, or whatever it's been programmed to do genetically. We also learned some responses in animals, and we can relate this to the tui. Plants such as that tree fuchsia, which flower in the spring, are usually those long day plants because flowering is actually initiated when the day length exceeds a critical day length. So if you're going into spring, the days are getting longer. So if it wants to start flowering once the day hits a certain length, it's probably going to be a long day plant. Now, you could also say that this is the same as saying night length is less than a critical night length as well. So this means that all of these fuchsia plants coordinate their flowering because that critical day length will be exceeded in spring all at the same time. So in all the plants, once they hit that certain day length, they're all going to start flowering. And just before we finish, we've really still been discussing a lot about plants. We need to focus on animals as well. So we learned that in animals, you've got your internal biorhythm, you've got your external environment, and you've got all these cues which line them all up, and there's entrainment as well. And we could say that endogenous circannual clocks in birds, so that's their annual clock, their yearly clock, help to synchronize those seasonal behaviors. That's like mating, reproduction, hibernation, migration, anything else you can think of that happens on an annual scale. So circannual is roughly a year. That's your internal body clock for a year. So this endogenous or this internal mechanism is entrained by synchronizing cues or zeitgebers. So this is a great use of the key words we learned, and that just means our internal mechanisms or the things we do internally happens because of the cues that we have outside us called zeitgebers. So the primary cue or the primary zeitgeber is the photoperiod, the length of the day. So entrainment is the adjustment of our internal body clock, which means that us animals are kept in exact synchronization with the environment that we're living in. So these are the mechanisms for animals that we've learned about. So if you put all of that together in one big answer, you're going to have a huge excellence level response based on biological timing.